Check, check. I'll introduce and say something about the night. First, some opening comments, and then you.
All right.
All right, very good. I thought they were, but I don't know. Let Scott do that. I think they're expecting him to sit up there. Oh. Hey, Scott, we're ready. Tough game last night.
I know.
I watched the end of that. Bruce turned it on there at the end.
Yeah. But they're playing the Nationals out. It was tied 3-3, bottom of the ninth. And then my sister just texted me, Javi does it again. He got a home run for the third run.
Yeah.
So I got to ask her that.
Make up for that error last night playing third. I thought, just throw. What was he doing? That was crazy. We went and saw him play back in June, we went and saw him play the Reds, the extra inning game they won. It was fun, right? Okay, I'm going to use the microphone just because we have some electronics hooked up and we want to make sure that everybody's voice gets on the recording because we do trap this. I'm Todd Lambert. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Elementary Schools here in Poudre School District. I'm going to be the person that keeps this process going tonight. Just tell you just a little bit about what we're going to do. We have some representatives who are here that have expertise probably lined up with the potential questions you may have, so we want to make them available to you tonight. So we'll have that group here to answer questions that you may have. We'll begin the night with Mr. Scott Nielsen, who's our Assistant Superintendent for Secondary Schools. Scott will do a presentation, give you some information and some context for the conversation. And then the way we work it out, those in the audience, they'll be able to write down questions or comments. And so here, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute and the process that we'll do. The presentation takes about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and we'll again begin the question and answer process, and I'll do some introductions. But first off, we have some opening comments just from our superintendent, Dr. Sandra Smizer. She just has a brief message for you. She'll hand that back to me, and we'll get going on with the evening.
Well, thanks for coming. When we hold something like this, we never know if anyone will show up, so we're really glad to see you. So thanks for being here, and our biggest hope for tonight is that you will say what's on your mind. We have a presentation to make sure everybody starts with sort of a common level of understanding of what we're considering, but we have no plan for where the conversation may go because the whole point is for you to speak to us. Some people have asked, is this a done deal? Have you already decided you're doing it? I will say there's strong interest on the part of the school board to do it. But we've engaged in this process with an open mind, and we really are here to listen. If we do go forward with it, we'll have some problems to solve, and I suspect some of your worries will tell us what those are. We think we know what some of them might be, and already after one of these sessions, we've heard some that we hadn't really been focusing on. So please don't think that we're not listening or we're doing this just as a formality. We really are taking good notes. Also, if you don't feel comfortable speaking tonight, or if you think of something later, there's multiple ways to talk to us. So the survey is still open and will be for weeks. And so you can always, some people have specifically told us they're waiting to come to one of these first, and then they're going to fill the survey out. So we're watching the results as they come in, and we have high levels of responses from people. In the thousands of people are responding to the survey and giving input. So that only helps us as we proceed toward decision making. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Smizer. A couple of introductions are in order so you know who's in the room. And somebody you're not going to pay attention to because she's sitting back there but really makes a lot of stuff go, Mrs. Valerie Van Ryn. She's in our communications group, and she has a lot of influence on the work that we're getting ready to do tonight, so we really appreciate her work. Thank you, Val. We also have Matt Gold from Channel 10, who is right here manning the camera and is putting that camera right on me. But wave, Matt, so they know who you are. All right, very good. Working with the audience. How about some of our experts tonight? We have Mr. Dave Montoya, who's our Executive Director of Finance for the district. We have Mrs. Vicki Thompson, our Executive Director of Human Resources. I already introduced Mr. Scott Nielsen, Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Schools. We also have Mr. Matt Bryan, who's our Director of Transportation, and Mr. Pete Hall, who's our Executive Director of Operations. We also have a couple others in the room tonight. We have two of our board members here. We have our President, Mr. Christoph Fev. and also Mrs. Kathy Kitt, former president of the board, and they're representing us tonight. And we are going to have more and more walk-in at a 5:30 start. We have people that are trying to find parking, and we know they're going to meander in, and that's just great. The way we're going to work it tonight, we're going to ask you to use the index cards to write your question or your comment. And so I would just ask that if it's a comment, write that on your card. Say this is a comment or comment, put it in quotes or whatever, because sometimes you don't have a question, but you have something you want to say. I'm not going to hand the microphone over. It works a lot better if you have that. I can read the questions. As the questions come in, if there's some themes to them, I'm going to go ahead and try to merge those themes just in case we have any redundancy there. And I'll read the comments out there as well. We'll give you time to do that. You may have more as the time goes on. So Val will be coming around and collecting those. She'll hand those to me. We'll get prepared for that. But again, first thing we're going to do is we're going to have Scott do a presentation. Scott, you ready?
Yes, Todd, I'm ready. Sound ready to go. As both Todd and Sandra said, thanks for coming out tonight. I hope you're okay with me down here. I'll be able to move a little freer down here than I will up on stage. It's exciting, I think, to have a chance to talk to individuals, but more exciting for us to get feedback and to hear your voice. So we'll get to that in a minute. I want to start with, we're going to do a little interesting tonight where I'm going to have to give hand signals to move slides, so bear with me as I do that. We want to start tonight by saying we've been engaged in this process now for a little bit over a year. The board asked us to study the opportunity to move start times starting with the school year 1920. They asked us that about a year ago. And so we've been engaged in a process of looking at research. You see on the slide that research indicates that high school students perform better and are safer when they start their school days a little bit later. The American Medical Association recommends a start time no earlier than 8:30. And as you look at that, our start times currently for our secondary schools range between 7:25 in the morning and 8:15, 8:15 being Kennard Middle School. All the rest of our secondary schools are quite a bit earlier than 8:15. We also recognize as we move through this process that it's a big change, and it influences or affects many families as we look at a change like that. So that's why we've taken our time and tried to plod through this, both trying to give information but also trying to get information. Both of those two things are critically important. The first thing we did last early second semester is we sent out a survey to try to gauge where our community was at. What were they thinking about? We had a response rate of over 17%, which for PSD and our survey results was about 3 times as high as the results normally are. So a great response rate back. 85% of the respondents supported some kind of move for secondary students. There was a lot of energy saying we support what the research says, and so we would like to look at some kind of move. What was interesting was that of all the respondents, though, whether you're talking elementary, middle, or high school, the best start times for everyone was between 8 and 8:30. And it was exactly the same at each level. The feeling about when to start school didn't shift. And the way things work for us, we're unable to do start times that bunched up. So that's a challenge for us as we continue to look at it. And we heard over and over and over again that, yes, we like the idea of starting later, but the end times pushing later in the afternoon were a challenge. And we heard that from students. We also heard that from high school parents. Largely because of what that last bullet talks about, allowing students to have time to do their homework, whether they're working, after-school activities, athletics. Those were the concerns that we heard from the community as they responded to that survey. Some of the other findings we heard, as I talked about to start with, that it would impact family schedules. It certainly does shift the schedules that we typically have. There's some cost and logistics in terms of what happens with elementary school students if we change their start times, if they end up going earlier. What's the child care look like in the afternoon? In some cases, it made it so families didn't need it. In other cases, it meant families did need it. So it does shift the impact potentially. Start and end times for staff was something we heard to consider as we think about it, because it does shift the routines that some of our staff may have been in historically. There's a cost consideration to all of the, and so as we get through, as we talk about the 4 different scenarios, you'll see we lay the cost for those scenarios out in front of you. We also were over and over, we heard, please look at research as you make this decision. Let research be your guide in some sense. And so we've tried to bring that into the presentation and into the decision process as well. The second thing we did, so we did that survey early second semester. As we got into late second semester last year, we put together a committee. And our committee represented all feeder systems, so all 4 major high school systems and their middle and elementary feeders. They were all represented with some leadership on that committee. We had parent representation from each of the feeders. We also had several representatives from the district office, and we had several community members, including a couple that, one that was a sleep expert. We also had someone on there from base camp, feeling like that was a pretty important voice. If in fact we were to make a change, how do we meet the needs of students with that possible support before and after school shifting? Base camp plays a large role in that. And so the committee met during May and June. And the task for that group was to consider both the feedback we saw in the first scenario and to ultimately come up with 3 to 4 scenarios that we could bring forward and engage in community comment, the sessions we're doing over the month of September, but also in a secondary survey with more information about the scenarios to let our parents and our students, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders, share their feelings about the 4 scenarios. So that's where we sit right now, is in the middle of those 3 or 4 scenarios that we'll walk through tonight so you can have a little bit more detail on what we've brought forward. So as we started digging in, one of the really important pieces, or one of the pieces that plays a major role in any district the size of PSD, is how we move kids around. It's a big piece. And often we'll hear individuals say transportation drives the decision. In the end, I will say Matt and his team have been awesome, and they can do just about anything, and there's a cost. And so you'll see as we get into this, we tried to get to some possibilities that were manageable with cost rather than overwhelming with cost. But Matt and his team ran scenario after scenario after scenario to try to give us an idea what the possibilities were, and ultimately what the costs were to pull those off. But as we think about PSD, as you see up there, 1,900 square miles, we have a huge area that we move kids around in. That's critical. We run 600 runs and 128 different routes, so 128 buses. About $100,000 for each bus that we purchase. You'll see that, the importance of that in a little bit when we talk scenarios. And when we buy a bus, it costs the district about $37,000 to move the bus around for a year. So that upfront cost in year 1 would be buying the bus and running the bus for $137,000. And then there's an ongoing cost for every year after that stays at that $37,000. And that makes some sense in a little bit when we talk about each scenario. Several years ago, we shifted to a tiered route system that allowed us to be more efficient and not have a whole bunch of buses that only are used for a short run or a little bit of time, but now we run our buses about as much as you can in a day, right? We try to get as much from each driver and each bus as we can, and that's pretty critical because right now, the way the system works, we're having a hard time finding the bus drivers we need to run the number of buses we have. If we had the number of buses we had 10 years ago, we'd be in a pickle because we'd have a hard time finding drivers. So that's important that we've created this efficient system, and it's also a system that we have to be able to move around to make it work for whatever we decided to do with start times. As you see there, hiring and retaining bus drivers is a challenge. Currently, everyone that works in transportation has their license to drive bus, and they all do, including Matt, our director, who drives a bus often throughout the school year. So he's often not able to do the other things he should be doing, but he's out driving a bus to fill in for some of the bus drivers that either are out for the day or in some cases are holes that we're having a hard time filling. So that's important, and something our committee wrestled with a lot was how do we increase largely the number of routes when we're having a hard time with what we currently have. So the committee landed on 4 scenarios that we decided we would bring forward. We had several we looked at, but the 4 we brought forward were, 1, the current start times, and we felt like that was important because there was enough energy in survey number 1 that said, let's not shift anything. So it's hard when you see that energy to not keep it as part of a possible thought process for us to think about. Scenario A moves our high school start time to 8:30 and keeps the current start times for most middle schools. All the middle schools except CLP stay the same. CLP would move because those students riding the CLP bus also are on the Poudre bus. So its start time will shift to be aligned with Poudre's. So CLP would be the only middle school, and most elementary schools are untouched as well. Scenario B moves our high school start times to between 8:55 and 9 o'clock, moves our middle school start time to 8:05, and moves our elementary schools to between 7:45 and 8:50. This is what you'd call a flip. We've taken elementary that's in our current model, in most cases start after the high schools and middles. And in this case, they would start, many of them would start before the high schools and middles. And scenario C moves the high school start time back 5 minutes between 9 and 9:05, moves the middle school start time to 8:35, and closes the gap, if you will, between the elementaries to between 7:45 and 8:40. So those are the 4 scenarios we brought forward. I'd love to spend a little bit of time digging in to each one just a little bit. I think we'll start with the current start time. Obviously, in that, we're starting our secondary schools before the research would say you should do it. So we don't meet what we're going to use the AMA, but there's lots of research that talks about that 8:30 start time. In the current model, we're not meeting what that research would say. Maintaining those times would have little impact on the system, requires little change. It also, as we do that, there's a cost, and you'll see this cost reflected in all the scenarios. We anticipate that with growth in our district, that we'll have to buy 3 buses and run 3 additional routes next year. And so that gives us a first-year cost of about $411,000 and an ongoing cost of a little over $100,000. So the current would cost that amount of money to make happen. We go to scenario A. That's that approach that moved our high school start times to 8:30. So it aligns our high schools with what the research would say is best practice. It leaves middle school start times, as I said, except for CLP, unchanged. So our middle schools, those secondary schools, wouldn't be aligned, wouldn't be moved closer to what the research says. It is the least impactful option for middle schools and elementary schools. Only 5 elementary schools and 1 middle school would have anything changed in their schedules. So in terms of the system, aligning high schools with research, it's the least impactful. In this scenario, it moves the high school end times to roughly 4 o'clock, which may have an impact on after-school activities, athletics, jobs, internships, concurrent enrollment, family time. Those are things that often happen after school. Those are things that would have to be moved back because now our high schools are getting out roughly an hour later than they get out currently. In this scenario, we believe we'd have to get 6 buses, the 3 we talked about in the current, and 3 more for a year 1 startup cost of a little over $820,000, and an annual cost of a little over $220,000 that it would cost us to do that scenario annually, at least year one, and as you go on, you're continuing to run those same routes. We go to scenario B. This is the first scenario that is considered a flip, where you move many of the elementaries earlier. This moves our high school start times back an hour and a half, roughly. And obviously they're aligned with starting after the 8:30 start time. It moves our middle school start times closer to the recommendation, but not there. It moves them to 8:05. It flips the elementary school start times earlier. We end up with 10 elementary schools that start at 7:45. Currently we have 1. It moves the high school end times closer to 4:20, 4:25. Again, impacting some of the same things we talked about in scenario A: activities, homework, potentially a job, internships. All those things would have to be shifted later in the day. In this scenario, the cost is 5 buses for a cost of $685,000 with an ongoing cost of $185,000. And that, again, includes those 3 we'd have to do in current. So it's an additional 2 buses to do that one versus the current model. Scenario C moves the high schools back 5 minutes, as we talked about initially, moves the middle schools to about 8:30, 8:35. So it has the high school starting an hour and a half later, aligned with research, has the middle school starting past 8:30, which aligns the middle school students with research. Again, it flips the elementary schools. In this case, 9 schools would start at 7:45. This one has the high school end time closer to 4:30. Again, impacting the same things we talked about in scenario A and B. The cost of this scenario C is 8 buses for a little over $1 million, almost $1.1 million in that year one, and almost $300,000 annually to make that one happen. So through the process, those were the 4 we landed on. We looked at a lot of models. We looked at models. One of the things we noticed in the survey was that 8 to 8:30 start time was important to all families. So we started with several. We had one that had high school starting about 8:15. The cost was almost $3 million in year one, and almost $800,000 annually to do. And so the cost was heavy. But the other thing that the committee really focused on over and over and over again, they'd come back to, can we really hire that many drivers and have that many drivers driving with us ongoing when we're struggling to have the number of drivers we have today? So that was a challenge. That's why we decided to pull that one out. We had some scenarios that moved the elementary schools back to 7:35, and some will say 7:35, 7:45. That doesn't seem that big a deal. The committee decided, everyone in the committee decided that 7:45 was the earliest we were willing to go with elementary students. And some of that, I think, was based on the fact that we already have an elementary school that starts at 7:45. So we know that's happening for elementary students. Moving it earlier, there was nobody on the committee that said that felt like the right thing to do. So that's why we pulled that one out. We had one that started at 8:45 with middle school starting 50 minutes later and elementary school starting between 8 and 9. Again, the cost of that was over $2 million. And again, the committee felt like not only was it too much to start with, the ongoing cost was pretty heavy, and it required a lot of drivers to pull that off. It's almost 16 or 17 drivers, I think is what it was. So that was a big deal for us, so we pulled that one out as well. As we look at our next steps, we're in the midst right now of our community engagement. This is community engagement number 2. We'll be out at Fossil Ridge High School next Thursday, doing the same thing, same time, 5:30 to 7. And then we'll culminate our community engagement sessions 2 weeks from tonight at Rocky Mountain High School. And that session's a half hour later at 6 to 7:30. So that's the community engagement piece. The survey that we've asked community members to fill out has been open since the end of August. It will be open all the way through September. We have, Lauren, today, how many have we had respond? 6,100. So 6,100 people have responded to this point. We're looking forward to a lot more responding between now and the end of September. If you haven't had a chance to do that survey, we're hoping you get some questions answered tonight and that you help us with your feedback through that survey. And then our plan is that we've told the board we'll bring them the information compiled from the survey with a recommendation in November, asking them to make a decision hopefully in December. The earlier the better, because if we end up making a change, the more time we have as district staff to help make sure that transition's smooth, the better. We see our neighbor to the south is having some challenges with their transition, and so it's important that we have plenty of time for us to put systems in place and make sure that if we make a change, we do it well. Now the fun part of the night.
I already have questions. We have some experts that are here tonight. Thank you, Scott, for that. We really appreciate that. Again, we have Mr. Matt Bryan, who's our Director of Transportation, Mr. Pete Hall, who's our Executive Director of Operations, Mr. Dave Montoya, who is our Executive Director of Finance, and they are picking up on their cue to go up on stage. Right now I'm sitting here with about 4 or 5 questions. I really appreciate that. Just a reminder of how we want to do business tonight. If you have a comment and not a question, that is fine. Just make sure we know it's a comment. So we can read that for you. I won't hand the mic off to do that. If it's a question, do your very best to get those to me. I'm kind of try to merge some of them together. As legible as possible is fantastic and an added bonus for me, so I appreciate that. Our guys have taken the stage. Scott, first question's for you. Okay, some of our schools have a 0 hour, and the question is, will schools be permitted to have a 0 hour and have that early start if they so wish? You may want to explain what 0 hour is to the group real quick if they don't already know that, and then take that question.
Yeah, 0 hour is an interesting time, and I would say at this point no decisions have been made. That certainly will be part of whatever recommendation we make to the board, and the board will have to decide whether they want to go. But a 0 hour is something that we provide students before the beginning of school. We have many music classes that happen before school right now. That would be considered a 0 hour. We have, I'm trying to think of what other classes are offered before school, but it's the possibility to teach a class before school actually starts. And so if you think about scenario B or C, where our school day wouldn't start formally for high schoolers until roughly 9 o'clock, you could run a 0 hour that starts at 8 o'clock, gives them the same amount of minutes as a typical class, runs 4 days a week, and they'd have a class that happened before 9 o'clock. And in that scenario, they'd still have an extra half hour of sleep over what they currently have. So we have some options with 0 hour. Some of the other districts we've looked at through this process have been pretty adamant about no 0 hour. But it's something we'll have to weigh and look at in terms of trying to meet the needs of students if, in fact, the change is made. It does provide an opportunity to mitigate some of the challenges you have by moving the end time late, particularly when you think about athletics and activities. If you allow some of those students to do some work before the school day, you can mitigate maybe what they might miss on the backside. Some of those students could have an open period at the end of the day. And I know some people, when I say that, will say, well, what's the move for? If you made that move, it's with a small subset of the population, and the move to a later start time would be everybody. But again, that 0 hour conversation is something that we'll, as staff, have to weigh before we make a formal recommendation to the board.
All right, thanks, Scott. I appreciate that. Just want to make sure my mic is good here. I'm back on. Scott, I'm going to stay with you for just a little bit. Last week, and when we were at Fort Collins High School, we had a lot of questions and a lot of interest regarding athletics. And so we've already started out tonight having a few of those. So I'm going to merge some of them together. We appreciate that. I know we'll have a couple of different phases of this, but the first question has to do with students at the end of the day. As this schedule moves forward and keeps them in school later, they potentially could miss more school on an athletic trip. Any thought on how we're going to deal with the situation for students who may miss parts of their afternoon trying to be good student athletes?
Yeah, so one of the things we have learned from other districts that have done this before us is that there is a possibility that they're going to miss more academics if they have to leave for sports. But we also have learned from other districts that once you make the change, that there are many districts that will work with us in terms of what time the competitions start, moving the start times for the competitions back slightly so that they don't have to miss nearly as much school as they would if the start time stayed exactly the same. What we've heard is that in some cases districts are willing, or schools are willing to work, and others aren't. And we may have flexibility in how we structure the start times of our own events. And so we can mitigate some of that, and there's some reality that if you move the start time or the end time back to 4 o'clock, that there's going to be some, you're not going to cut out the missing of some academic time. It's not going to happen.
Scott, the schedules are usually controlled by the home teams, right? And just stay on athletics for a minute. There's a question regarding when schedules are in our control. Is it our intent to adjust those based on this schedule, taking it forward, home teams?
We have more control of our home events, but not complete control. Some of the events that are at home are dictated by CHSAA. Some are not. And that will be true when we go on the road as well. And certainly we would work with the other schools to see how flexible they'll be. Some won't be, and some will be. And as we continue to see more districts taking a look at a model like this, we'll have more districts that are willing to put forth this effort. I will say a district like Cherry Creek was adamant at the beginning of saying they're going to work as hard as they can to not start sporting events at their home sites that force kids to miss school. And when we look at what Cherry Creek has learned after doing it year one, they still had students that missed academic time just as we do right now.
Okay, I just want to remind the audience, you can submit their questions to me, whether it's a comment or a question. Just want to let you know I have some questions. There are some long ones on here with a lot of kind of comments and questions embedded together. Just try to get our questions so we can put them in a form that we can ask our audience. I'll do my best to read through those, or ask our panel up here. I'll do my best to read through those and try to get them in a question form, but please know some of these are getting just really long as far as a comment and a question, so clarify what you want to have there. I'm going to switch over to Dave. Dave, I got a comment for you on cost analysis and how you've looked at this. Talking a little bit about the costs associated. Scott did a nice job of showing what it costs to do get a bus driver, get a route, some of those type items. Are there any other costs that maybe Scott didn't have up there that if we go to one of those scenarios, what are some other impacts in the system?
Yeah, I would say that the analysis that's been done is pretty high level at this point. We would also still need to look at some of the operational staff, changing school start times, impacts when people are at the building, people that are often there before the teachers. So that's one thing I know that we would need to look at. Utilities is another one that I know Director Hall and I have talked about, that utilities, we may be participating more in the peak hours, things like that, so we need to be mindful of that. But I do believe and agree that the majority of the costs are going to be the transportation costs as outlined earlier.
Okay, Scott, this one will come back to you. I know you've looked at some other school districts, in particular Cherry Creek and a few others who have moved to that later start time for high school students. A couple of questions on that. One, maybe just a general statement about what we've learned, if anything, from those school districts, or what maybe, I know they're early in that, what they've shared with us or what we've been able to pull from them. Also, has there been any examples, or have we learned through that, of student attendance issues? One of the questions came up, we have students who are going to still be at home after parents leave. Could that potentially be an incentive not to come to school?
So we have learned quite a bit, and I think Cherry Creek has been pretty open, and one of the things I'd say we've heard through this process from lots of people, we heard it in the initial survey a bunch, is that if you start school later, then the high school students are just going to stay up later, and it's not really going to accommodate. Well, Cherry Creek, they did a nice job of kind of pre and post and working with our students, and I'm looking at, they talked about the amount of time that the students went to bed. They went to bed a little bit later, just like was suspected. About 13 minutes is what the students said they went to bed later. So their going to bed still about the time their body's ready to go to bed. So they went to bed 13 minutes later for high school students, about 8 minutes later for middle school students, and elementary students down in Cherry Creek went to bed actually a little bit earlier. They slept 61 minutes longer at the high school. So that ended up being a net of about 50 minutes more sleep for the high school student in Cherry Creek. They slept for about 40 minutes longer for the middle school students in Cherry Creek, and the elementary students slept for about 20 minutes less. One of the things they talked about that they didn't expect was, for the secondary students, the sleep on the weekend evened itself out. If you have high school students right now, as I do, the weekend sleep pattern is different than during the week. There's this catch-up that they do on the weekends to catch up for lack of sleep during the week, and and so they saw that evened out over the weekend. The other thing I thought that was interesting is that they saw a 30% increase in the number of students getting enough sleep. It jumped from 26% of their secondary students to over half. So that's a big shift in Cherry Creek. They also talked down there about some of the mental health outcomes for students, something we talk about in the district a lot. And they had reported by students 6%, and now keep in mind for Cherry Creek is in year 1, 6% decrease in feeling nervous, a 9% decrease in feeling worried, a 9% decrease in drowsy driving at least once a week, and a 12% increase in feeling ready to start the school day, and a 16% increase in being alert for first period. So that's the Cherry Creek data. The other thing that I think is interesting is they just listed in their outcomes positive changes. The middle school students felt less rush in the morning, less conflict. The elementary students felt more energetic and more reported going out to play in the afternoon when they had a little bit more time as opposed to having time in the morning. And the high school report out was interesting. The high school report out, they're saying was life-changing. The high school students felt a huge sense of relief down in Cherry Creek with the opportunity to sleep. And they talked about being able to go to school when the sun is up as being a big deal for them. They also talked a little bit about their staff, and that middle school teachers, it was a shift for them, because if we think up here, if we make one of those changes where the middle school staff shifts, middle school right now starts about 7:45, and so their day's early and ends relatively early. If they move back to an 8:30 start time, their day moves back. Elementary teachers down there were delighted because their day moved from later in the day to earlier in the day, so their day ends earlier. And the staff for the high school it took a little adjusting because their day starts later and ends later. And we're thinking about that change and what's going on with the adolescent sleep patterns. Well, us as adults, we don't have that adolescent sleep pattern that the high school students have. So for us as adults, easier to get up and get going and get your day going. So that's what they saw for some of the staff feedback.
Let's stay in that one about patterns. First time we have a comment. I'm just going to go ahead and read this one in line with those sleep patterns you're talking about, Scott. I'll read this one right off the card. I appreciate this. Research shows teens need a little over 9 hours of sleep for optimal health. Their brains are hardwired to have difficulty falling asleep before 11 p.m. Knowing that at 11 p.m. and getting 9 hours of sleep, that's going to be an 8 a.m. wake up. So 8 to 8:30 a.m., a start time at 8 to 8:30 is too early. It's not going to meet those needs. Scenario C is the best option for the health and well-being of our teens. One of the questions came up, what research have we found on elementary students? You've heard a lot about high school. I'm going to go ahead and take that question if that's okay, being part of the committee. We're trying to learn as much as we can from our partners out there that are making these moves, our potential partners, as they learn from their experiences. The issue of elementary research or research on elementary age students is not as robust as what we have right now from the AMA regarding our adolescents and their sleep patterns. We are looking at what elementary students are reporting. Scott mentioned that about the opportunity to be a little bit more energetic in the morning, have an opportunity to play after school. We're going to continue to monitor that. I don't know if you did catch, though, one of the slides had an elementary start time that could potentially be as early as 7:30. And the committee felt, you know, just right out of the chute with some of our folks on there, parents and experts included, that was simply too early of a start. Just a reminder, that earliest elementary start that we have is a 7:45. But the original question about do we have a lot of research there or what research have we had, we're still gathering that one. I would say we're much heavier on that research for our adolescents and their sleep patterns. Get here a couple of the questions that we have. Go back to athletics for just a little bit, and this Scott's a scheduling question, a little bit different. Question is coming from one member in the audience about, will parents and students have the opportunity to know what classes may or may not be available or offered at the end of the day to be able to choose an off period potentially? I know some of our students, as they accumulate credit, have an opportunity to take an off period. I think they're talking about, will they have the opportunity to strategically find that off period in case they're an athlete, maybe leaving early?
I think that question is correlated a lot to that 0-hour conversation, and maybe you do it even without 0 hour, but I think the answer would have to be yes. I can tell you our high school principals already are thinking that way and have approached us both about 0 hour and also how flexible they would be with an off period and strategically placing the off period. Often right now, a high school student may get an off period and it just lands wherever it lands. Strategically placing that and looking at how we can be strategic would be one way that we could mitigate some of the challenge that the late end time could place on an athlete, and possibly other things too. A family could make a decision they want an off period at the end of the day if they have a job that makes sense, and that we strategically look at how do we do that and give students and families some of that autonomy, if you will.
Thank you. Matt, you look like you're ready to answer some questions up there. I've been saving my best ones for you. Okay? A couple of them, a combo transportation question. Matt Bryant's our Director of Transportation, has been involved in this work from the very beginning. Matt, is the district taking into consideration students who use city buses to get to and from school? So that's the first part of this. Is that our knowledge about how many of our students do that? Is that a factor in some of these decisions? And is the district working with Transport to address these possible changes?
So yeah, we do have a relationship with Transport, and we're constantly meeting with them and discussing how we can expand their service to provide more transportation for our students. They have done a really good job of placing some strategic bus stops around town so that students can use them to get to all the high schools. Have a good bus stop. The issue is how they're developing their routes is probably not keeping up as much with our needs for students to get from certain areas of town to the schools because they're using hub stops. Instead of neighborhood stops. So that's still a challenge that we're working with them together. As far as how many students use it now, I don't know the number. We've asked them to track that. They don't really have a way of tracking how many students are riding their bus, but they're working on trying to figure that out for us. I can tell you the stop here at Poudre is a huge stop, and it's very widely used. And I think it grows every year and gets bigger and bigger. So I do think the community is embracing that Transport is an option, and we'll work further with them to try to make that more available to more students. And I think in the future that would help some of these costs as well, drive those down for the district, and take advantage of the public transportation.
I'm going to take a moment to read a comment. We really appreciate that. Comment regarding the detrimental effects of sleep deprivation in teens. I'm going to do my best to read all these. Again, these are the detrimental effects of chronic sleep deprivation on teens. It's a comment from our audience. Those include absenteeism, decreased academic performance, decreased graduation rates, depression, increased use of illegal substances, and higher incidence of car crashes. They want to remind everyone that the American Academy of Pediatrics says that this issue is an important public health issue that significantly affects academic success. There's a little bit more on this comment. Although many challenges exist, no issue or cost, transportation, sports, work schedules should prevent us from working to eliminating these detrimental health and academic effects on our young adults. That's a comment from a member of our audience. We appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. Scott, I don't think they thought you answered the question regarding the potential of truancy clearly and completely. We had a repeat question. They said, don't think you quite got to that one. Just wanted to remind, the question had to do with the fact that students being home later after mom and dad leave, could that be some kind of incentive, or maybe even are the districts were communicating with seeing any increases in truancy or absenteeism, skipping school?
We actually have seen the attendance in the schools we've worked with go up, not down. Again, you have a chance for students to get the right amount of sleep, to feel better about what's going on, to have less anxiety around being at school. And so you start to deal with some of those challenges. There aren't a lot of students that get up and on a typical day say, I don't want to go to school, but there are things that over time get in the way of going to school. And when you start thinking about addressing, whoever the comment was from, some of those mental health challenges, you have a chance to get kids more equipped for school. So what we're seeing from some of the districts we're working with is their attendance actually goes up. The research talks about that also, is that attendance is better when students have the right amount of sleep. They're just in a better mind frame to do the work they need to do. And if you think about what research is saying in terms of those things that go down, the mental health, we deal with some of that. You end up with less drug use. All those things move us to making worse decisions, of which truancy or skipping school is a part of. So the research would tell us that attendance gets better, but certainly there's the questions as to whether that actually happens.
Thank you very much. We have a comment, another comment from the audience from one of our students, which we always appreciate that perspective, so I'll just read this. I really appreciate this comment. If we use scenario C, as a high school student, I would get up at 8 and get home at 5:30. Personally, I would like to get home earlier than 5:30 every single day, especially because I would like to get a job this next year. It would be nice to have some time to be 15, 16 years old every day, especially when it is still light out. I appreciate that comment.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kind of comments. I know where that came from. Thank you very much for that. I'll take this one, give you guys a break, even though Pete hadn't got to really jump in yet. Pete, I'm waiting for your question. I promise you I'll give you one if it's right there. There's a question about efficiency of learning. Is there an option to start at 8:30 and end at the current time? So still get that late start, but work on efficiency of learning during the day. I guess I'd answer that two ways, and I'll take that one if that's okay, and if anybody wants to jump in. I can assure you we are always looking for efficiency of learning. Our teachers have a lot on them as far as the standards and things that they have, the classes and content, and I would think if you talk to some of our principals, they may think that day is already pretty short trying to get in and do the things they're trying to do. But I think right now the real question on the table is, have we considered an option where we would end at the same time start? We won't. That's not one of our options that's there. It's also something important to keep in mind. Our high school students are under some guidelines for the number of minutes they attend class. There's some pretty strict guidelines in the state of Colorado regarding how much time they have to have in the classroom. By going ahead and starting at 8:30, which essentially would take 55 minutes to an hour off the day, and ending at the same time, I know for sure we'd be way off on those number of minutes. That's a little bit of it. That's an issue with the state of Colorado. So again, back to that question, could we start late, end same time? It's not an option on the table. We'd be certainly, with those numbers, would be out of compliance with the state of Colorado at the high school level for sure. Go to a couple other ones here. Scott, I'll give you this one. Is the district taking single-parent families into consideration, or those who commute, how that may negatively be impacted if there's a late start, and how that would impact their schedules and their family schedules?
Well, I would, first of all, I would say the answer is yes, and I mean, just in that case, I grew up in one, so there's a challenge in whatever you do. Now, I would also say that you'll end up benefiting some as well. So there's a challenge in making a change. You are going to affect some of the patterns we have, and you're going to change the patterns for others. I think when you look at a decision like this, and I think this is what the board charged us with, is how do you look at, ultimately, how do we get the best out of students? And that's what you're looking at right now, is if in fact that's what's the case, are we thinking about how we help students be the best students they can be? But there's no question that when you start to make a shift like this, it will have an impact on individual families. Some will be positive and some will be negative. And it's hard to marry that. I can tell you right now, though, that we have some families that starting at 7 or starting at 9 o'clock in the morning for an elementary school can be a challenge because they have to go to work at 7:30. So there's challenges in the system currently. It just feels like there's not for when we're in the flow, but there's no perfect system of start and end times for school. Nobody's figured that out around the country, what works for every single family, because there's lots of things that school or other things interfere with in terms of what families are dealing with. And we have lots and lots of families who are working super hard to make things go right now in this district. And we certainly want to partner with that. And our responsibility is to educate every child every day. And so that's one of those things at the heart of any decision that we make, is how do we do best by kids.
Thanks for that. I am at the end. I know Val may be having a few more. She's processing back there, and we're going to get to some questions. Do you have any more for me back there, or are you just... Not immediately. We want to remind everyone that you have an opportunity tonight to make a comment. We really appreciate those. Those were great. You have a chance to make a comment maybe after you've heard the audience or heard other audience members ask their questions and heard our panel suggest some things and give you some information. I don't know if there's anything else out there. I'm currently holding no more questions. So I think a lot of you have had an opportunity, I think, with this group to ask what you wanted to ask. I just want to make sure one last round, if there's any other questions coming our way or anything else you'd like to add, I want to make sure you get the opportunity to do so. It's also a good time to remind you what Scott said earlier. We have plenty of opportunities for feedback and information. We've had over 6,000 take the survey. That's a great number. We also keep the questions that we have from each of our sessions. Last week we were at Fort Collins High School. We'll be at Fossil next week. Of course, we're here tonight, and then one more at the end at Rocky in a few weeks. We are capturing all of those questions and answering them and archiving them for you. So not only can you hear what's going on with your peers and folks here tonight, you can also go to that website on the start time study and get all of those questions and all the things that go with it. I will tell you, you had similar questions to those at Fort Collins, but not exactly the same. And I would, if I could go back and encourage them, I think it's great to see how different perspectives are out there in the community. But again, if there's any more questions, we'll take them. If not, we are going to wrap up for this evening. Okay? Again, we really appreciate you being here. It's great to have you. If you think of some other things and you want to come to another forum, we'll be at Fossil Ridge at 5:30 next Thursday. And a couple weeks after that, we'll be out at Rocky Mountain High School, and that'll be a 6 o'clock start because of some work going on at their school, some things happening. We'll get a little bit later start on that. That website's going to stay up. Closing date for the survey? October 1st. That date's coming sooner than you think, right? It's good. We're approaching that. So if you haven't had a chance to take that survey, which is open to all of our constituents, please do so, okay? Thanks again for coming tonight. We really appreciate you taking your time to be out here. Have a great evening.